Everyone, welcome to another session of American Public Policy Redux. Today's Thursday, April 8th, 2021. We're very excited to welcome current St. Mary's Professor Mark Belanger.
I like that word, current.
Current, yes, because Pat, being retired, had to make the distinction.
I won't be current forever. The end is in sight, but I like that. I'm happy to be current.
You're current for now. We're very excited to tackle the concept, the very broad concept of immigration. As you know, we are being recorded. So if you would like to answer a question or ask a question, you can jump in at any time. Just know that you will be recorded. And if you would not like to be recorded, just simply use the chat feature and send your question on over to me and I can ask it for you. And so that's all I got. Without further ado, Mark, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you everybody for coming. And it's really a pleasure to be here with you all. I've been on Zoom a lot the last year, and I guess I've gotten kind of used to it. So it doesn't. But I enjoy being able to see people when I can. So as well, some of you had me when we were here when I was at St. Mary's, and some of you not, but you know that I'm not a scholar of American public policy. I teach comparative politics. I teach about immigration though, I've taught about immigration in a couple of contexts. There's something called the Intercultural Studies program. There's an introductory class. Immigration is a big issue in that. It comes up in some other ways, relation to questions of citizenship and race, identity. In comparative politics, those of you who have my class remember that I focus a lot on how national identities form and some of the tensions and challenges and conflicts within them. And so I approach this issue from a somewhat more, I guess, global perspective. That's not better perspective, it's just that's a sort of way I think about it. And I thought it'd be more, I'd have more to offer if I kind of just set out how I see the issue in historic terms, how I see it in institutional terms today. And I also would add, though, that I'm also the son of immigrants, which isn't obviously visible in terms of stereotypes, but my parents were from Canada. I'm the father of a young man who adopted from Guatemala. So I don't view this issue with any degree of dispassion. I believe immigration has been a good thing for the United States. I think there are, reasons for policing borders and having immigration policy. But I also believe that my parents, came here as lab techs, and I don't believe they had any more right to come here than people who've come here to pick our vegetables do. And the people who come to do those things don't have any less right to be received legally and viewed as valuable contributors as my parents did when they came as lab techs in the 1950s from Canada. We can see, I think, currently that everyone says the immigration system is broken. And I think more generally, we can see that the capacity of Congress to deal with this issue has really become almost nil in the present political context. I think Pat and others can talk a lot more about the dynamics of how immigration works within the systems of committees and structures and the rules and the things within the Senate, within the House. But I think since the failure of the Group of Eight or the Gang of Eight or whatever they were called in 2012 after the re-election of President Obama, after people like Marco Rubio realized that the political consequences of pursuing that were ones they weren't willing to pay, it's been ruled by executive orders and by kind of changing kind of concepts of and discretionary policies and different ways of applying the concept of discretion. So we saw that under Obama with things like DACA and other kinds of policies. We saw that also different using discretion in terms of what were the priorities about who would be focused on for deportation. We saw vast, numbers of ways Stephen Miller, got in and interpreted statutes in different ways and the like. What I want to do is a couple things. I want to at heart, challenge the idea that what we currently have is a law-based system. And I'm going to do that not by looking at all the statutes, but by talking about how that system has evolved and emerged over a long period of time. And I'm also, in that regard, I'm going to be looking at it from a more global and historical perspective. And again, not the only way to look at this by any means, but it's the one that I'm more familiar with and I feel like I have more to say about. And the obvious thing that comes out of that is to say that the current issues we have and the debates and even the terms of that debate are not new. They've been around for 200 years or more. The first Naturalization Act in 1793 defined citizenship as, for free white persons, men, of course, at the time. And there was this focus on who was fit to be a citizen of this new republic. I mean, there was the concept of everyone was equal in some way, but not everyone was fit to be a citizen of the United States. What kind of people did we want to have as citizens of the United States? Now, US expansion and global expansion, the Industrial Revolution, colonialism, all those things, had the effect over time of complicating that question a great deal, because it made the United States gradually a much more diverse place. The expansion of the capacity to produce the market for cotton led to expansion of the slave trade in this country, or not the slave trade, but certainly the expansion of slavery as an institution. Then the consequences of colonialism in Ireland, eventually in China, other places, Philippines, Mexico, the emergence of modern states in Europe and the social disruption that caused produced massive waves of immigration in the 19th century, in the 1840s, and then later in the century. And immigration law became very much a part of how this got mediated. And at each point, you had variations on the same debate. A debate that on one hand said, these immigrants are needed for, you can go back to the 1850s and talk about the way the Chinese were talked about in California. And it was, they're doing things white men won't do. That's not a new argument. That was repeated in the 1920s in Texas regarding Mexicans. It was repeated in a variety of settings over a long period of time. And so the terms have, gradually, at least until Trump, had become slightly less overtly racist over time. But they hadn't really changed in terms of this economic kind of push for more labor and the need for more labor, and the way that was being driven by these global processes that were pushing people out of places that were negatively affected by the process of industrialization and colonialism, and toward places that were the emerging sort of power centers of that process. In that regard, what I've always tried to stress in talking about this with students is that globalization and the racial and ethnic diversity of the United States have gone hand in hand for a very long period of time. The United States has been a diverse country for a long time, but it wasn't really until the 1970s and 80s that the full kind of meaning of that began to get debated in a much more, I think, direct way. In the 1980s, and some of you who were in high school and in college in the 1980s will remember the emergence and the kind of coming into vogue of this term multiculturalism. And there was a big debate about, what should be in the classroom, what books should we read, the whole dead white male debate and the like. And that was an important debate. And it was sort of a philosophical and a pedagogical debate. But I began to see, and I argued when I taught about it, that multiculturalism had to be understood not simply as a philosophical perspective on pedagogy that we could either think was good or think was harming the republic or whatever, but better understood as a condition that had been deepened by globalization and was being deepened by the current process of globalization in the 1980s. The movement of goods always brought with it the good movement of people. That's been true for a long period of time. People like Marx understood in the 19th century that capitalism disrupted places, moved people around. It didn't care about national borders. And that's remained to be true now into the 21st century. And so multiculturalism was with us, regardless of what you or I, or in terms of the debate of the 1980s, Pat Buchanan or Henry Louis Gates or anybody else that was writing about it thought. And so when the NAFTA debate occurred in the early 90s, the pros and cons of that were debated in terms of, was free trade going to be good for Mexico, the United States, whatever. But it was completely predictable that it would also probably lead to more immigration out of Mexico, even though the proponents of Mexico, of NAFTA in the United States, both the Bush administration and the Clinton administration, presented it as, this is going to help Mexico develop, and therefore it will, which again, no evidence, the evidence of any country that's experienced expansion of US foreign direct investment in their country has always been outmigration. South Korea, the Dominican Republic, the Philippines in the past, and of course the liberalization of India and China in the 1980s and 90s. It's not an accident, again, I'm not a Marxist, but that was sort of, it's not an accident that led to, China and India becoming two of the largest sources of immigration during the last period, along with Central America and Mexico. And so, again, and that it's not surprising that this recent period of globalization reflected with the end of the Cold War, the emergence of the internet, the expansion of the World Trade Organization, the outsourcing, all the things that we associate with globalization. It's completely unsurprising, really, in historical terms, that led to the largest period of migration into the United States since the beginning of the 20th century. A process that, after, in the wake of some of the reforms of the 1980s, was more open than it had been in the past. So in that regard, immigration, I think, is very much built into the structure of the US economy. It has been for a long time. And with that, the diversity that goes along with that has been part of that. You've probably seen the statistic that 45% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants. So I think there's a lot of evidence that it's been a positive thing, but it's certainly, whatever one thinks of it positively or negatively, I'll come back to some of the reasons why people think it's negative in just a minute. It's built into the structure. If you just look at how did cities like New York become so much more multicultural in the 1980s and 90s than they did before, it's because they didn't just have Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. Now they had Colombians and Mexicans and people from, and Chinese and Indians and all kinds of people. And what happened, well, the reason for that is that you had those cities become what sociologist Saskia Sassen called global cities, places like Houston, New York, Chicago, Seattle, LA, where you had a kind of emergence of high-end and low-end kind of specializations, outsourcing. Some companies that changed their internal promotion structures started to outsource a lot of what they had previously paid people to do. That generated demand for the highest skilled labor from all over the world, but also demand for lots of, delivery people and cleaning people and hotel workers and restaurant workers and the like. And then, a positive fact of that in New York for people and Washington and other places was the emergence of more culinary variety than ever before, but also a greater kind of income inequality and gaps in terms of the labor force. So the policy debate that came out of that was, it's been the typical one of jobs. Are people taking jobs away and or not? And then there's also been this underlying question about race and national identity and fitness for citizenship. And so I would argue that even the stealing our jobs issues are a mask for the cultural anxieties that this process has generated. In the 1990s, Samuel Huntington, political scientist at Harvard, who's no longer living, and did some good work earlier in his career, wrote a book called The Hispanic Challenge. And in it, he basically said that the United States was creating, that the emergence of a large Hispanic immigrant community was going to fragment the United States because you had a large group of people who didn't share what he called our Anglo-Protestant work ethic and culture. I think a lot of people said, well, regardless of that overt, kind of racism of that the cows are out of the barn as far as, changing that process. But I think, and that's, I think both critiques are fair, that it's both, one could be opposed to it morally, but one could also say, if you don't like immigration, that means you don't really like economic growth in the United States, because those two things have always gone together. And so that's kind of a larger framework for how I see the issue. I wanted to say a little bit about the current issue in Central America, because it's a region I know a lot about. And that's really where the the crisis today is. And I don't pretend to have a solution to that crisis, but I wrote my PhD dissertation about Guatemala in the late 1980s. I took students to Honduras for 7 or 8 times between 2004 and 2014 for a short study abroad experience, sort of combination of service and learning, really more learning than service for most of the students, I think. And so I wanted to say a little bit about what's happening in Central America from my perspective. It's going to be kind of schematic, but I think, and it's going to be a little bit pessimistic too, but that's, reality is what it is sometimes. And we can talk more about that, and we can have a lot more, questions, discussion about that. But the current, there's been a lot of discussion in terms of why this outflow of immigration from Central America, particularly from the Northern Triangle, as it's known, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And really, over the last year, El Salvador's, for good and bad reasons, its internal situation is a little more stable, but Guatemala and Honduras are as bad as they've been. And so, so what I want to say is that the roots of that are, unfortunately, partly, and the explanation and some of the cause of that is in the hands of the United States, and particularly the Reagan administration and the wars that took place in Central America in the 1980s. I'll just say, on a personal note, that in many ways, it's because of those wars that I'm sitting here, because in those days I got involved in an NGO in Boston called Oxfam. I went there initially because of what they were doing in Cambodia in the wake of the Khmer Rouge regime and the problems that was caused. But Oxfam got involved in doing some work in Nicaragua, working with refugees from El Salvador that were in Honduras, dealing with refugees in Mexico from Guatemala. And it's really the point where I got interested in trying to understand and then become very much in opposition to the foreign policy of the Reagan administration. So I went to graduate school, got a PhD in political science, focused on Latin America. So the outmigration from this region began in the 1980s, and there was refugees fleeing the war, and it was overwhelmingly Hondurans, El Salvadorans and Guatemalans at the time, and then gradually more and more Hondurans. They came in large numbers to Los Angeles, to Houston, to some other cities on the East Coast, and particularly in Los Angeles, this is where and then some of them were able to come here legally and get something called temporary protective status. There was a big debate in the 1980s about asylum. Some of you, I know some of you might have been cognizant of this debate in the 1980s. There was a kind of very much of a discrepancy in Reagan administration policy between the ability of Nicaraguans fleeing a government that the United States was opposed to, were able to get asylum. El Salvadorans, in spite of the murderous policies of their government, Guatemalans the same way, because they were allies of the United States, were not able to. Likewise for Honduras. And so then in the 1980s, some of those countries went through kind of democratization processes, for lack of which were quite incomplete. I studied the one in Guatemala in my dissertation. The one in El Salvador was a little more successful in some ways, but this led to some people going back. It also led to some repatriation processes in the 1980s. And it led to some hope that those governments, which had been for a long time ruled by military dictatorships, through this process of democratization would perhaps become more stabilized. But what ended up happening in the context of neoliberal policies and democratization was states that simply got weaker. And we could talk more about that, and less institutionalized. And one of the drivers of that was the movement of the effect of the drug war in Colombia was to reorganize the way the transnational cocaine trade worked and other drug trades to make the Northern Triangle countries, which were weakly institutionalized, some parts of the territory that the state has little direct control over, essentially became the fiefdoms of drug cartels. That process corrupted the political system even more, a political system that was already, political systems that were already riven by corruption. Other things that happened was Hurricane Mitch in 1998, and a series of another serious hurricane this year. But one thing that I remember very clearly in 2004, when I went the first time with students, we visited a village in the southern part of the country, very rural area, which was very much a product. You could see it as a result of the lack of any kind of strategy of rural development. People that were staying there were working with an NGO on some sort of sustainable agriculture and the like. But a lot of people had to go to the capital. We met people in the village who had family in the United States, in New Jersey, in New Orleans, in Houston, and the like. But what they were talking about in 2004 was how weird the rain was getting. And talking about how the rains were unpredictable. They wouldn't come when they were supposed to come in June when they plant their corn. They'd come late. It'd all come in 2 weeks rather than 6 weeks. It was climate change, and they were talking about it as climate change in 2004 in terms of the way that some of the patterns with La Nina, El Nino, some of the other things were causing much more disruption in agriculture, making it all the more. And so you began to really have climate migrants in both that region. Then in Guatemala, there was some of the same. There was also the expansion of soybean. I mean, not soybean. What's that? One of my students wrote a comp about this last year. I should be remembered a kind of product they used to make oil, and I'll think about it in a minute, in northern Guatemala. But the result was that between government neglect, the increase in gangs, and the effects of climate change, there was some effort at creating a kind of maquiladora assembly plant operation in El Salvador, Honduras. There was some success in that, but not nearly enough to absorb anywhere near the need for employment. And so you had really until the economic meltdown and economic recession in 2009, continual flows of migration into the United States during the Bush administration and into the Obama administration. It slowed down a lot actually in the next few years from Mexico, but the process in immigration out of the Northern Triangle has not really, it began to accelerate in 2013, 2014 as the essentially, as those countries became increasingly failed states in any useful application of the term, I think. Failed states sometimes are simply because the capacity of the state is weakened by war or whatever. These are really failed states because the elites there have no interest in making them otherwise. That's really, they're not, in the wake of the civil wars, in the wake of democratization processes, what they learned was they didn't need to have military dictatorships any longer. They could simply have, that the elites there could work with the international financial actors. They could work with drug cartels, and they didn't need to make a better state, and so they haven't. And so you've had an incapacity to deal with the security problems that have driven people out. And so the problems then that have festered in that region for a long period of time and years of inaction have sort of all come to fruition now. And I'll say that I don't have a really, I've kind of went through all that kind of quickly. So if you have specific questions, we can talk more if you're interested in hearing more about some of the countries. But the thing that I think, well, let me just put it this way. Whenever I hear anyone talk about, we need to have a mini Marshall Plan for Central America, we need to help create conditions in which people won't leave and things like that, that I've become I think the impulse to do that is a good one. In some cases, it's a humane one. Sometimes it's a cynical one. But if it usually involves things that are designed to the usual ways of promoting foreign investment, creating more jobs, those haven't worked in this region. In the 1960s, the Alliance for Progress. In the 1980s, There was something called the Caribbean Basin Initiative. There was the Central America Free Trade Agreement in the 1990s, CAFTA in the 1990s, in the beginning of this century. And none of them have put a dent in any of the things I'm talking about. And again, it's because the Marshall Plan is based on the assumption that there you have states that were weakened by war, but had the capacity institutionally and the capacity in human terms to rebuild if they had the support from the United States. But there were functioning states. They weren't always democratic in the past. They didn't become immediately wonderful democracies. But in places where that's never been the case, you can't simply make it, so I think we learned that in Iraq, where everyone wanted to compare Iraq to post-war Germany and Japan, a ludicrous comparison in my mind. And El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras are different than Iraq, but they have, there's the same kind of problem with a political elite, political class, which is managed to make it very difficult for genuine, citizen movements to get anywhere, and have created political systems that work just fine for them. And there's really no need to change them. The current government in Honduras, the person at the top, he may be eventually removed because of his connection to the cocaine trade and to drug traffickers. But that's one person. There's other people who will come in after him and be happy to take over his perks and the like. And even if a person got elected who had a different agenda, then the question is, you need a state, and you need institutions, and you need institutional capacity to do that. To have a rule of law, you need to have institutions that protect the rule of law. And in Honduras, there's sort of a system where you have a tacit sort of ceasefire between drug traffickers, criminal gangs, and the state. And sometimes they go to war with each other for a little period of time. But and I think the weaknesses of those states was made evident in the way that Trump could bully them into carrying out policies that were not popular in those countries, but there was no real way to hold them accountable. And their only accountability really sense of accountability was to whatever pressures the United States could put on it. So I think I've talked for almost a half an hour now, and I have some thoughts about what a more realistic legal system or legal response to this would be, to deal with the actual demands on the economy of the United States and the actual demands for immigration. I would say, that everyone talks about these people ought to get in line, but the reality is there is no one line they can get into. There's a bunch of different lines, but for some people that come here, there is no line to get into. There's no way to even, if you say, where do I go to get in line, senor or monsieur, or whatever language you're using, there's really no good answer to that. Even people who have, the capacity to bring their families here, that can take 10, 20 years or more. And so the system is broken on multiple levels. And the refugee and asylum system, Trump did a good job of trying to gut that. That's going to take some time to fix. So this whole, I think, notion that some people, the undocumented people, want to come in and jump the line, to me is a very cynical and also just very inaccurate assessment of the way the system works, and that they're somehow taking, there are people that have waited, good people that have waited years, they've gotten in line, you should get in line too. It doesn't work that way. I think I could ramble on a little bit more about these things, but I think I'm going to stop there and ask, have comments, questions, ideas, maybe things you'd like to hear more about, things you'd like to add to what you've heard. And I see a few new people. Oh, hey, Leticia, Anna, Paige, great to see you. I can't see you, but I can. So thanks for everybody for being here.
Thank you. I don't know currently anyone that could give a comprehensive historical, global, economic perspective on this issue in 30 minutes. So I think kudos to you. I think there needs to be more people in government that have the grasp that you do and can explain it in a way that someone like me who's not necessarily who's not even close to being a scholar in this area can fully understand. I want to quickly jump back to the very last point that you made and your perspective on Central America, which I appreciated. Again, not knowing as much as I would like about that area of the world, even though I've visited. So your perspective is that essentially the countries that you've mentioned just all throughout Central America, that they're a failed state, that no matter what, it doesn't have the structural components nor the leadership components for anything to be done in that area, that those countries will be as they are. Therefore, the immigration will be coming from, for the various reasons you've outlined, immigration into the United States will be coming from those countries, regardless of any effort or suggestion that one might have to do something in those areas to prevent the flow coming to the United States. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say there's nothing that could ever be done, but I think that what I've said is that it's hard to see. There could be periods of time when, maybe because of global economic conditions or something, people will find their reasons to stay there. But I think, and again, so I think that we can expect that we're going to continue to have, whether it's going to be in the numbers it is right now, that may be a function of some of the messages that people have gotten back in Honduras and Guatemala, especially about conditions in the United States, the ease of coming in, all that, from whether it's from coyotes or whoever it's coming from. So this particular period we're in right now, the numbers might diminish, but I don't see any reason to think they're going to go. I mean, they rose for a time during the Obama years. They rose, they went down again, they went back up, I think figuring out some way to, can we have everybody who wants to come here under those circumstances come here? Well, that's not my question to answer. I mean, I think you can't just say, get rid of ICE. I mean, you can say get rid of ICE, and people can, and I'm not going to say but I think that there has to be some way of figuring out how to make the asylum system work so that people either can have a protective status or something that more people can. Also, some of the people that are coming, they have family in the United States already. That's why they're coming. That's why they were sent. That's why the kids were sent here. They weren't just sent here to go and fend for themselves in the streets of Houston. They're here because they have family already here. And so there are mechanisms in place through family reunion and the like to resolve the circumstances of some people. And it's my own view that I think we have that. It's my own view that we should make an effort to enable as many people to come what the number is exactly, I'm not in a position to say. And when we have to send people say no, I don't have a good answer for why we say no to some and not to others. That's, again, I think for people with a lot more experience at these things. But you can say no to people and then go back. But one of the things that is happening now, and partly as a result of some of the things Trump did, is people are going back to Mexico and they're just coming back. And so again, figuring out ways to, the least recent articles I've been reading of saying that the number of people that are being turned back that have been here 3 or 4 times already over the last several months is more than ever. That it's a significant percentage. I don't remember, it's 30 or 40% or something like that. So that's an indication that we need something better than what we have now. And I think, yeah, I'll stop at that.
Anne, did you have something related to that? I know Leticia raised her hand, but go ahead.
Yeah,
Anne.
why don't you let her? I have 2 questions. These are about 2 issues that Mark didn't address that I just wanted to see if he'd address. So go ahead, Leticia.
No, I didn't have a question. I came in late, so I don't want to ask something repetitive. I was just scratching my face. So sorry.
Sorry about that.
Well, I'm glad you made it. And you may, from where you are and from your perspective, you may have things to add to what I just said, or some ways of thinking about what how to resolve some of those questions, just from being much closer to at least the current center of the problem. And I'd sort of welcome hearing anything you wanted to add about that.
I'm going to just listen for a little while longer and make sure I'm not saying something that was already said. So I'll turn it over to Anne.
Okay, so I have two like completely different questions.
Okay.
One of them is from the perspective of, since your specialty is comparative politics, and I don't hear this talked a lot about, although certainly we do read about it. You know, are there any parallels to some of the challenges and just the overall situation that we have in the US in terms of immigration, the tensions, the challenges, that has some parallel with another country somewhere in the world who maybe, and who has even been able to perhaps either through legal mechanisms or sort of address this and manage this issue better? So that's one question.
Okay.
I just don't hear that talked a lot about. So that's my first question.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question, Anne. Anne, when were you a student here?
I graduated in '88. So
Okay, good. Yeah, I came in '95. Well, it's nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
And that's a good question. I think the answer is, in a way, is no. But well, there's certainly examples. I mean, I've seen people do things, say, "Oh, the Mongols were great at this. They found lots of ways to integrate the people they conquered." And on one level, that was true. And the Moors and the like. But in terms of recent history, no. But I think that in fact, in some ways, I think that if you look at Europe right now, and you look at what's happening in Europe, there are some individual countries that on particular issues, their policies may be more humane in some ways, but I think they're only just beginning to deal with the kind of diversity that the United States has lived with for a very long period of time. And in those countries, it's not, I think it's, the United States was the last country really among the industrial democracies to develop a sort of Trump-like party as a significant party. There's been parties like that in Europe, in France, in Denmark, in Netherlands for a long time. There's new parties that have emerged in Italy and Germany and Scandinavia over the last years. And so I think that they have a lot harder time. I think what they can learn from us is that at some point, that the issue of race has to get dealt with directly. They've tended to ignore the fact that it's a racial issue. I think for a long time, that wasn't ignored in the past, and because there was a clear white supremacist framework to a lot of the kind of thinking about this within the, and after World War II, I think in the civil rights movement, there was a sense, well, we don't, that's behind us. And I think the recent kind of emergence of Trump has made us come back and recognize that part of this, there is a significant kind of cultural anxiety about who's an American, will America change, will it lose its European? Those are all the issues that they're talking about in Europe too, but they have less language, I think, than we do, and less history to rely on. That doesn't mean that we can we can say to them, well, just do what we did. That would be not good at all. But I think we can at least say that we have, our experience, our failures and our small successes can in some ways be something that can offer some tools for them. I know that, for example, in France, there's been a real resistance until real recent to acknowledge race isn't a category in their census. They don't measure it. It's not they consider it wrong to measure it. And I think that's beginning to change. But I think there are certainly, I've read about, like I know Pat knows more about Sweden than me because of where Rachel lives. I know that I've seen some interesting things about programs that police develop working with Somali refugees there and immigrants there and the like. But I also know that Sweden has, an anti-immigrant movement there as well, or a party that isn't as strong as it is other places. So I guess the answer to your question is, from my mind, is no, but I think that in some ways the United States can at least feel like as bad as our discussion is, there's been some progressive dimensions of it that I think other countries might, who have tried to avoid the whole notion that they're ever going to be multicultural or have the kind of race relations problem the United States has, by simply trying to say, if they come here and they learn to be Swedish or they learn to be Dutch or they learn to be French, they'll be just fine. I think that's proven to be more complicated in practice. I don't know if that's an answer to your question or not.
Yeah, that's helpful. And just one other question, and it kind of gets back to what you were talking about at the beginning, but then you were talking about, I guess the other dimension and I observed this. I was at Department of Justice for a couple of years between 1998 and 2000, and worked with what was then the INS, the Immigration Naturalization
Right.
Service,
Yeah.
did some studies in their office. But essentially, this issue of, and we sort of, as Americans, we sort of talk out of both sides of our mouth, right? Like, people are so concerned about immigrants, but yet we don't actually. They come here. People give them jobs, right? And so
Right.
the business sector, they want these immigrants, and they don't actually want, at one level, they don't want enforcement
Right.
of the laws, right? So
Right.
like, I'll just give you an example. When I was at Justice.
That's why I think that's what
Yeah.
I meant by saying that the law, that to the extent that this is a law governed system, it's a system where there's laws, but it's what you just talked about is really driving it. But I'm
But
sorry.
there's no way in America we're going to enforce that, because the business sector doesn't want it, and the business sector influences Congress. I'll just give you examples. When I was at Justice, the people would say, well, yeah, we'll do like business enforcement until we get the letter and the call from Congress that tells us, why are you in my district hassling my businesses, right? And so
Yeah.
then they have to pull back. So they can't even really, so we kind of, it's all illogical. So
My
I'll
favorite
stop.
example of that is that in the 1950s, the McCarran Act was an act that restricted immigration, but it had this thing in it called the Texas Proviso. He was from Texas, that basically allowed, that said in Texas, people who hire undocumented workers will not be, bothered. And so again, it was like, don't ask, don't tell on one level, and yet, there was overt restrictions on pretty much anyone who wasn't from Northern Europe. Different
So it comes
kinds,
down to
different
money, right?
Yeah.
Money.
Yeah, and I think that's where but that's been the debate for a long time in somewhere. That's been true for a long time. That's my point. You can go back to the 1920s and see, again, the language is a little bit dates it as, but it's essentially the same thing, that, Americans won't do this job. And then, others saying they're coming, they're changing our culture. They don't speak our language, all those things.
Let me throw in Mark mentioned Sweden, and
yeah, I'd love to hear more about what your perspective on that is. Yeah.
Well, just a little. Sometimes, folks will want like big dramatic things you do to make things better, but sometimes there are small things that you can do, and one small thing that Sweden does is to provide a stipend, to provide a payment to every immigrant who enrolls in classes where they learn Swedish. I want you to think about, the sort of reactionary folks that you can run into who have a visceral response. Why can't these people speak English? Well, we don't do anything like that. We don't do anything like that. Rachel, well, actually, they've now all met Rachel, at least virtually. That was a great experience for her, not just learning the language, but the classes also introduced everyone who was there to Swedish culture.
Yeah.
So, and a major issue pertained to some of those Somalian refugees, where gender roles worked really, really differently for them than what they were going to find in Swedish society. So they got introduced to the notion that, in this culture, relations between the sexes are going to look different than what you're used to.
Right.
So it's also that cultural piece that Mark referred to. That may not sound like much, but I think that would be a really valuable thing for the United States to do.
Yeah. Because I mean, the people who have studied this said that basically immigrants who are coming in recent years are learning English quicker than in past generations. But again, they learn it through because they need to, and they know they need to, but they don't get any help doing it. I mean, there are certainly organizations in town, Casa d'Amistad here, organizations in other cities that do work like that. But it's piecemeal, and it's not the government doing it. It's local NGOs and local civic organizations.
Yeah, and I don't. I have my. Actually, I don't know if you know, but there's a place called the Puerto Rican Bakery and Coffee Shop.
In
It's
town
on Lincoln
here,
Way. It's on Lincoln Way.
Lincoln. No, I haven't gotten out enough the last years. It sounds how long is it?
It's actually not far from where we used to live, downtown. It's just a few blocks.
I'll have to go look for
blocks
it.
west.
I know about some of the Mexican places over off of Western and Bendix, but I didn't know about that.
Yeah, and this isn't that far west. And so Omar and Anna, they got their business started just before the pandemic started. And this is Kristen Klosky who told me about them. And it was part of my mission to help support those restaurants that got started at like the wrong time. And Omar and Anna and I kind of become friends. Every night after he's worked all day long there, he spends an hour on Duolingo.
Yeah.
The poor guy is absolutely exhausted. He spends an hour every night learning English.
Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah.
It's phenomenal.
Go ahead.
The other thing I wanted to Anne's second thing is, and Mark alluded to this, and I think it's really, really important. You could take this from, from the public policy class when it comes to implementation. Whether it's ICE or INS, those agencies and the agents have incredible amounts of discretion.
Yeah.
Incredible amounts of discretion. And a major reason they have all that discretion is that they're dealing with a constituency that has no representation.
Yeah.
So they can do whatever the hell they want. There's not the notion that if they did something horrible to an immigrant, that there would be much political fallout to that.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to go through the whole story, but friends of mine in graduate school and I had an interaction with those characters, and like we're all white, and the guy was just absolutely appalling. You could only imagine how poorly he would behave dealing with an immigrant from Central America or Mexico or whatever. So that this is another kind of hypocrisy, right? Those businesses, they want those immigrants. It's not as though they're going to do anything to deal with that discretionary behavior on the part of those immigration agents.
Yeah.
As long as they keep the flow of labor coming in,
yeah,
they don't care.
Yeah, I think
about
that's
the
where
suffering that those folks experience trying to get there.
Yeah, you've got to. I got to think though that there'd be some value in having this whole process be regularized, or in some way normalized, in some where people could have, there was some kind of a status, and it wasn't for people that in that position, that rather, everyone talks about guest worker programs. Bush talked about one, and then in the beginning of his administration. I was just reading what Megan said here. I can't read the whole, but the, yeah. Other questions? I want to read what Megan said here because it was.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, I think that, she made a good point. She said, let's be honest too about who's accepted here. In Maine, the largest number of undocumented people here are from Canada. I'm not hearing very many people who are angry about that.
Right.
So it goes to the racism element that you had spoke about earlier.
Right. No, I mean, I have never had anyone ask me where I was from. And I think that's, as a first generation American, that's, I think, all about what Megan's talking about, because no one's ever looked at me and said, oh, you're not from here.
Funny, Mark, because I had people ask me that I'm only half white. But whenever I say my name, they're like, where are you from?
Yeah. Yeah. I remember. Yeah. Yeah. No. Other comments, thoughts, questions?
I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how America's failed immigration policy has really led to income inequality. I mean, it's really exacerbated the problem, obviously, because we can't deal with immigration and can't be fair and equitable, and how that has really ratcheted up.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you probably have as much to say about that as I do, Jennifer, but I think that, clearly it's served the, having this vulnerable labor force that you could pay less has meant that they're not paid well, and it's meant that it's put lowered pressure on. And again, if there was a legal process for people doing that, that would have to, I would think, make wages go up somewhat, but it would also, but it's been one of the things that's enabled companies to outsource, because a lot of these jobs and some of these companies have been taken up by people who are immigrants, whether it's in hotels, whether it's in businesses, and the like. And so I think that was what I was talking about when you look at what's happened in cities like Chicago and New York, is their labor forces have gotten bifurcated by that whole process, and it's made it very difficult for unions. I saw the headline; it didn't look promising for Amazon today. That's a little bit different situation, but it's certainly made for challenges. And there are some, unions, hotel workers in a few places that have managed to find solutions to that, or managed to, build something, but it's made it much harder. And as long as unions are hard, you're going to have a hard. It was the union movement that led to the strong union. It's not an accident that the time of the greatest income equality in the United States was the strongest time of unions, but you know that better than I do. I don't know that I have a lot to add.
And think about it working in the other direction as well, Jen. As we have increased inequality, sort of both domestically and globally, that sets in motion forces that will drive immigration as well. If you have domestic inequality, well then, okay, we now have these jobs that people don't want to do because they pay poorly. So we need to draw that immigration from elsewhere. And as we do things that harm economies in other nations around the world, well, the opportunity then is here rather than where they are. So I think it works cyclically, right?
So I had a thought, and Mark, you were talking about what seems to be a challenging problem to solve with Central America. This may seem completely out of left field, right? But it's been a very long time since the United States has really contemplated the idea of expanding its territory and the idea of just expanding our borders, right? Head south, incorporate areas that have had challenges in the concept of self-government and bring them in as, in fact, a part of the United States of America. And I just wonder if that is something that has kind of historical precedence, right? I think about, over time, Americans' intent to expand has rarely been about the citizens of where they're expanding to. It's usually about pushing America beyond where they currently are. But is that a potential opportunity for solving some of these problems that, from a self-governing standpoint, these Central American countries have had a challenge solving?
That's a really, there was a period in the past when a lot of people in the United States envisioned the United States going all the way to from Nova Scotia to Patagonia, as one Texas congressman said in 1840 or something. But I think that, I have a hard time seeing something like that because I think the challenge would be and the resistance would be like much as the resistance is to Puerto Rican statehood now, is that the kind of issues that it would present. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I mean, honestly, until you said that, Adrian, it was I had never thought of it because, again, I think the sense of nationalism in those countries would be one obstacle. But I think there are other people who'd say, well, if we can have the services, and if the United States is going to provide, you know, we're going to have part of the United States tax base and all that, that might be, and if the, you know, our elections take place in the way that they take place in, well, some places in the United States anyway, that might be a better thing. So it's, but I don't see it being very, it's hard to imagine I think that would cause a civil war in the United States between people who already think there are too many immigrants here. Not civil war, maybe like before, but I'm not sure. And the challenge of bringing, you know, something like Medicare to Central American countries, or social, or what, having, you know, the extension of the Social Security system and things like that would be immensely costly. So I think, I mean, when I think when I look to the future, you know, I mean, this is sort of horrible to say because I have friends in many, many places that, you know, in a better world, they'd prefer to stay where they are in the country they were born in. I think that humans as a species, we've always migrated, and yet most of us have remained. I mean, there's always been people migrating. And there's always been people that most people have stayed fairly close to where they were born. And I have friends now because of a program at Central America, in program at St. Mary's. I have students or friends across 5 countries in the Middle East and North Africa. And when I talk to them recently, I feel like I tell them, I think in 5 years, if I want to visit you, I'll be coming to Europe, not to Lebanon, not to Iraq, not to Tunisia, not to Egypt, not to Jordan. And I think that I think what's going to happen is there's going to be eventually migration again towards where the places that are environmentally sustainable, partly because they have the economic resources to be so, and you're going to have climate refugees going and economic refugees going to places where there are currently demographic challenges where they'll be needed. That's, to me, the longer term vision that I could see being a solution to this, is that there are countries that are getting old, they need immigrants, they don't know how to deal with immigrants yet, but they're going to have to. Japan's got the same problem. China might even have that problem eventually. South Korea, the United States is one of the few countries that hasn't experienced demographic decline in the industrial world over the last 20 years. And it's because of immigration. It's where our fertility rates have remained higher, but our immigration too. And so I think that it makes me sad as a father of a Guatemalan and who loves that country and thinks that the United States I put it this way, I've sometimes said that the United States might have won the Cold War, but Central America lost it. I mean, Central America was a victim. Some parts of the Middle East could say the same thing. Some parts of Southeast Asia, some parts of Southern Africa could say the same thing. And I'm not really sure that those countries as states are salvageable. And that's a terrible thing for me to say, and I hope it's not true. But I think that, whether they go to Europe, whether they go to perhaps countries like Chile or Argentina that make it, or Colombia, Mexico, but I think eventually we're going to have a relocation of people, and it's going to be driven partly by climate and partly by economic deprivation. And those two things are interconnected. So, and it's great to see you, Adrian. It's been a long time.
Yeah, it does feel like a long time.
Well, I don't know if it feels like a long time. I mean, what year did you graduate? 99?
99. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was like that group that was it came in with me in 95.
Yep, exactly.
It was a great class. You and Madeline, Stacy, and Megan, and Tysus. It was a great group. I mean, they're all great groups, but that one, because they came in when I was freshman and I knew some of them. And so your first 4 years was my first 4 years, or your 4 years was mine. So we've always felt a special bond to that group.
That's right. I remember the poblano peppers.
Remember who was who and in what class? That's crazy to me. How do you remember that?
I know, I saw him 2 years ago randomly on campus. He's like, oh yeah, 2006, you were with this person, this person,
Yeah,
this person.
I blame it
was
on
like,
I blame it on baseball cards. I just always had a good remembrance of things like that. I can remember what year Hank Aaron won the National League batting championship, 1959. I think I'm right about that. At a 355. So I have a certain Sandy Koufax, 27-9 in his last season. That's not that I shouldn't show off about that. Anybody knows that. Probably he was a baseball fan. But at any rate, so I always remembered stuff like that. I don't know. Yeah, in fact, yeah. So yeah, Leticia was 2000. Paige, you were 2015, right? Anna was your class 2. Michelle was the same class. Megan was 2007, and Michelle was 2006. I know the others of you, and you, Jennifer, you were the year before me because I met you at the when I came for my job talk.
Got it.
You were the one that had all the cool lefty stuff on your computer. Or not, it wasn't a computer, I guess, on your backpack.
raise your hand if you're not surprised. I'm just kidding, you get a hard time. Paige, did you have a question? Because I kind of have a big kind of pie in the sky question, but I saw you jump on video. Do you have a question? If not, I'll ask mine.
I just kind of wanted to get your take on like how I guess it's kind of twofold. I feel like with Trump, the conversation about immigration has shifted to more of like a culture war than it is the actual like economic or border control issue.
Right.
It was previously, even though it's like almost a misnomer because I don't know about the deportations under Trump, but I know that Obama had like the highest rate of deportations under his admin, but that was kind of left out of the conversation because he still appeared to be like not tough enough on immigration. But anyway, I kind of digress. I was kind of interested to get your take on not so much the wall rhetoric, but more or less like the detention facilities and how that is one, a human rights issue, but also kind of how that has changed the narrative of a lot of the immigration, like the questions and the sound bites that, Biden's asked, the administration's asked. I feel like that has taken a different, that's kind of taken the conversation of immigration in a different direction than we've kind of seen previously.
And tell me more about how you see that. It's nice to see you too, Paige. Tell me more about how you see that change, because I can sort of think about what I might think has changed, but I'd just like to hear more about what you think has changed.
So like an example of this was recently, I believe Biden did a press conference with the press corps, and a lot of the questions that he was getting about immigration were related to the detention facilities and the fact that since the admin has changed over, I think everyone kind of expected that that would be like a first course of business related to immigration, and it really hasn't. There hasn't been any significant changes in that. And out of all of the questions they asked, it was like continuous about immigration, the detention facilities. And I thought that was interesting. One, because before Trump, I never really heard a lot of conversation about the detention facilities, I guess. And I think that also plays into the culture war aspect of like Trump grabbed onto the wall. He grabbed onto the sound bites of these immigrants are coming, they're stealing your jobs, they're rapists, they're drug dealers, that mask of the immigration, I guess.
Okay, well, I think, you're right. I mean, it's an example, I think, of how Trump created certain, I guess, what you could call facts on the ground that are not easy, easy to change quickly. Because I mean, if you took people out of detention facilities and you don't send them back to Honduras or to Guatemala, where do they go? And I think there's also the question of, people who are separated from their children and try it. So honestly, I haven't kept up with the kind of what the plan is with that in recent, over the last few weeks. I mean, I saw the part of the press conference, but I don't know that I think it's an example of what they exactly, and I think they've got Trump, they've got Biden in what I think they consider a kind of trap that they're hoping he doesn't know how to get out of. And I think that in a way that is for reason for him to be kind of cautious about responding, because there's not really a simple way to resolve that problem right away. I mean, I think that he's probably I mean, Guantanamo was a different issue, but I think Obama now says he wished he just, but I think it was just not unlike with the issue with Guantanamo. What are you going to do with the people that are there? And I think here there's a lot more people, but you're right. Detention centers were not something they were using in the same way. That's a function of, and I think they're looking at the next election and saying, what are the things that they're going to try to screw us on? And, I think that's, whether that's one of them that really works or not, but so I'm kind of going around in circles. I think what you said before that I think is right is that I think we have to see this less as an economic issue and more, I mean, Stephen Miller doesn't care about jobs. He just thinks there's too damn many immigrants and minorities in this country. And I think that that's what Trump thinks too. So that's what
my question wasn't really clear as far as like a specific question. I guess it was just when I saw that press conference and I saw that like the press were like hammering Biden on the immigration, specifically the detention centers, I didn't necessarily disagree with like the questions were good questions and tough questions that should be asked. I was just shocked with how many questions were asked pertaining to the detention facilities versus various other things going on, COVID, his jobs bill, like there's a ton of other things, and the press was hammering on the specifics of the.
I can't. I think that part of that may just be the press's desire to head off any. I mean, to the extent that the Fox News world is quick to say the liberal media is giving Biden a pass on this. They may have been. I mean, they certainly, when you think about how they hammered Hillary and we think that the press was great to Obama, but that's only only relative to Trump. But they certainly, were not, always just giving him a pass. But I think that in this case, they may have particularly felt like, well, here's the issue that the Democrats were so critical of, so we have to do the same thing. And again, that's not necessarily. I mean, they have to kind of, to the extent that there's a sense that that part of the press feels like they're viewed now as the sort of media of the left, they may have felt like they needed to show that, no, we're not the media of the left. Whether they are or not, is another question. In
a sense, it's one of the most distorting things you can do is to listen to Republicans talk about the media, because it's just completely divorced from reality. What you really have is a group of journalists who, for a number of reasons, want to present themselves as objective, don't want to look biased, want to do, on the one hand, this, and on the other hand, source on one side, source on the other side. And for 4 years, they became increasingly bewildered about how they were supposed to do their job.
Right.
Well, now it's normal. This is normal journalistic behavior.
Yeah.
Because you have a normal president. So this is
right.
The kinds of things that you're observing, Paige, that's normal. You would kind of expect that to happen. And I mean, the additional thing I want to toss in there is my blind spot was not realizing that as soon as you got Trump out of the White House, it made sense you'd have a surge in immigration. And it's like, it's not as though a journalist is going to say, well, we understand this is something that Trump created, but we want to talk to you. No, they're going to take the shortcut. Say, oh my God, look at all the immigrants. What are you doing about them? And Trump furnished that additional vehicle of, through his policies, focusing people's attention on the detention centers. And so it was those factors coming together that took them there. So there was no kind of reaction one way or another. This is just journalists doing their job the way they normally do it.
But the interesting for me was the strategy coming out of the White House of how they responded to it. So rather than saying that, which is, of course, when you take a more humane approach to the law, you know, et cetera, of course there will be, it's quite the opposite. The messaging out of the White House is, this is cyclical, this is normal, this is expected. It has nothing to do with the Biden policies that have been put in place or the enactment of, you know, reinstating things that Trump did away with. They're actually saying that it's okay, that this is expected. They're really, 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 really downplaying it, which I was shocked in the end, because I think everybody here, we were nodding, we're saying, yes, of course. And we talked, like you had said, Mark, you know, the perception of American policy having to do a lot with that, especially as it gets trickled down all the way down to Central America, and then what the coyotes, the traffickers are telling them. You know, of course there's going to be a, now under Biden, America is a bit more favorable to your entry than before Trump. So,
and the other thing that it just hasn't been covered as much is that the hurricanes there last year were terrible. They were really terrible. Damage, you know, was just really terrible. It's still, and the people are still, you know, literally and figuratively digging out from that. So that's another thing that, and that's where I think, again, there can be some room for really just saying there's a disaster situation there, and people are fleeing that, and we have to try to provide them some shelter for the time being. Now, because, and again, that's where I think the detention facilities, to the extent that there's some other way to have, I mean, you know, refugee camps isn't exactly what you want to have, but it's that the problem is that they really were detention facilities, and to the extent now they're trying to redefine the relationship to people such that they're, you know, people being considered for, you know, being treated legally under our immigration laws, such as they are. But
I had kind of a closing comment. Go ahead, Pat.
Well, I'm going to kind of go. So I think that was, you know, I listened to those justifications coming out of the Biden administration about the situation, and I just hadn't really and thought, well, no, that's not true at all. But just this discussion leads me to believe that this is a political calculation on the part of the folks in the administration, that it was not political, that they believed it would not be politically helpful to look like you're shifting blame to Trump. Okay, that one, that's going to feed into all the stuff that's going to come out of Fox News, right? It's going to feed into that. Well, that, you know, this is what they always do. They just, okay. And that I think they perceived that it would constitute a weaker response and harm Biden politically. And you know, I don't know which one of those avenues would have worked better, but that would be my guess, Michelle, for why they went in that direction. It's, you know, guess, but.
Well, we'll see it play out. Mark, I want to, politics aside, I want to ask a kind of a pie in the sky dreamer question, and to say, you know, let's assume that you have a very willing Congress, a very willing culture in the United States, right? And you have a president that's very willing. So everything lines up and they say, we're going to throw all the resources behind the issue of immigration in the United States. So clearly this will never happen. But I'm more of like perfect world scenario. And then they came to you, Mark, and they're like, Mark Belanger, tell us, what would you suggest we do to address the current situation of immigration culturally, economically in the United States? Like, especially on the structural end, is there anything that you would say, this is how the United States should do better, or this is what the United States should do, assuming that you had this perfect world scenario? Is that even fair to ask?
It's fair to
And you're-
ask.
and you give the right response, and there's a cabinet position waiting for you.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think again that there's probably, I'm not coming up with an obvious answer to that question. I think that to me, there's just a lot of places in the United States where there's work to be done and people that want to come and do that work. I think trying to do what we can to, I mean, I don't want to, I think the drug war was a, you know, a lot of ways a problem, big problem. I think there's ways we can help those countries by changing some of the ways in which drugs operate in this country and changing this. That won't necessarily make the drug traffickers go away, but it would deal with some of the violence that is caused, it causes down there. But I guess I'd be for trying to make it less complicated, not as long, for people to want to come here and then I think that's, but I don't, I'm kind of drawing a blank on some great solution. I think that, yeah, I'm
No,
sorry.
that's kind of what I was thinking, was not necessarily like, oh, enact legislation 542 section 5, you know, I was more like the statement of don't make it as long and as complicated.
I guess I'd like to just have a real conversation about what it is that people do and the nature of work, and start to think about what kind of work do we value and what kind of work do we not value, because that's really the root of this problem is there's been this sort of idea that there's like good jobs. And I mean, if you ask the average, you know, person in the United States, do you want your son or daughter to work in a hotel cleaning rooms? In a lot of places, they'd say no. Now, some places that might be a viable thing to do. But if you ask, and so I think we have to start to think about, you know, how we value work in the first place. Why do we, why do teachers, why do people that work with children, why do lots of kind of people just, you know, why are we sort of stuck in these sort of permanent low wage jobs, and why does our economy, you know, require that? If we did that, then I think we might be in a position to then I think that would just make the country, that would be a productive way to move forward. And then within the context of that, we could then say, so, okay, we need people to do lots of kind of work that maybe some people don't want to do, but there are other people that if you pay them well and you make it possible to have a better life for their kids. In other words, if you treat cleaning, you know, cleaning rooms and picking food the way we used to treat making steel and building cars, then I think, you know, we just have a more humane country. And that would be so that's the kind of the conversation I'd want to have, is about the nature of work and why, because one of the things that's happened, and I certainly, you know, in St. Mary's, I think there is sometimes a sense of, you know, not that we're part of the problem, but certainly to the extent that college has become one kind of a gateway to a certain kind of life. And if you're not able to go to college for whatever, many, sometimes not good reasons, but sense of like they're fair, but in the sense that you can't, then, you know, you're kind of stuck. And I think that problem goes back to the problem of why elementary and high school educations are so unequal in this country, such that they prepare some people to come to St. Mary's and they prepare some people to really, you know, become drug addicts, to put it kind of crudely. And I think that's more than anything else. And so I think that that's kind of, I'm just kind of rambling, because I think that to the extent that there's been a sort of prioritization of a certain kind of high-end job as the goal of all upper middle class kids and people who aspire to anything, it means that we have a whole series of problems related to work. That my son works in the airport, you know, he was never really designed to go to college. But he's a really bright kid who, in the context of working for an airline, his spatial skills, his personal skills, his ability to organize himself and his passion for just doing his job well that he learned from his parents, you know, why can't we, I think if there's lots of people in the world who that's their work ethic. And unfortunately in this country, we've made it hard for people that don't have a master's degree or whatever to make a good living. And then we've let immigrants subsidize it, that lifestyle for us. And so I guess that's
Okay.
how I think about the problem and what I'd want to try to, but that's obviously requires a conversation about what we value that in terms of, and who we value and what kind of work we value, that would be hard to have, but it wouldn't be impossible to have.
Can
I
I know a
just
lot of
wanna
people, oh, go ahead.
Oh, go
I
ahead,
was just saying that,
Letitia.
Mark, when you hire me to come work for you, in this cabinet position, we're going to have a conversation about education, and the stories that we center in our educational systems are stories of whiteness
Yeah,
and stories of upward mobility. And I think that that is also part of the issue, is that as a country, we ignore the stories of brown and black people who built this country and Asian people who built this country, and we relegate them to a very small sliver of what we're teaching kids in our school system. So I think having more of an inclusive educational system
right.
that really tells the story of all of these communities and their contributions and how that's part of our economic system, how that's part of our country, I think also can have
Right.
some profound impacts.
I think, I mean,
But I am an educator, so.
well, I agree with you. And because I mean, part of the analysis that I gave, especially in the early part of my talk, comes out of the, many, many years of teaching, particularly one particular book that's called A Different Mirror about the history of immigration in the United States. But what students tell me after when they read about the Irish and they read about the Chinese and they read about Jewish immigrants and they read about Japanese immigrants is, and they read about what happened to Native Americans too, and they learn about how the connection of that to the expansion of cotton cultivation and things like this is, why didn't I learn this in school? Because when they learn it, they understand that they've been sold an idea about immigration that's a complete myth. But they're not, but then it's like not, oh God, my country's terrible. It's, oh, it's just, it makes them understand things. And I found that that's a really powerful, I mean, in the small little thing I've done in my agricultural studies class over the year, that students come and say, well, everybody should learn this. I should have learned this in high school. Why didn't I know about this? And so I completely agree with you because I think that, and I'm confident, I'm a little more, well, I guess I was going to say, I think that that's slowly changing, but it's not changing fast enough. And I think that higher education is helping with that. But I think what higher education can also do is try to reset the balance I just talked about what kind of work we value and what kind of work we don't value. And how we and the way we compensate for that, because I think that if we don't do that, we're going to always have that the gap between. I mean, I just read this book by the British writer Kazuo Ishiguro called Clara and the Sun, and it's about a future world where some people have basically access to genetic what do you call it, gene editing and things like that, and their kids are lifted and other kids are not. And if that's just a kind of further version of, and then they have these robots called artificial friends. Clara, the title of it is that. It's a wonderful book. It's also a sad book because it's plausible as a possible future, and it seems to me it's an extension of the way our higher education system has focused on one kind of future and not on preparing people to do lots of things and to live with each other in a more kind of harmonious, is too nice a word, but or too kind, but a more where we value each other.
If I can get to Letitia's thing, and this will get me to another point, to something that I don't know that we've gotten to, but I think it matters. A real obstacle, Letitia, is that it's worse at the state and local level.
I absolutely
K through
know,
12.
being in Texas, and even like I had a faculty in my graduate program that were on the committee to look at textbooks and what was included and excluded. And, he was one of the liberal voices. And yeah, no, I know. And that's where I'm thinking, where we have possibility to Michelle's original point, right, from a federal perspective, how, where do we have some authority? I know it's horrible at state and local level, but someone's got to come in and set an expectation.
Yeah, and the problem is that historically, education was a local thing, and you face political resistance every time, and sometimes it's certainly disguising the racism and sexism that's there. That becomes this resistance to the federal government stepping in on and I'll use the horrible language that they use, and canceling our culture of Texas, and so there's the subterfuge that gets used, and the forces that are behind, and that's gonna be hard to go. But I don't think that folks realize the depth of the problem at the state and local level, at lots of those states. I think there's just ignorance about how bad the situation is, and as long as things are done on that state and local level, it becomes difficult to get the level of visibility where you can start attacking the problem. The other thing I wanted to go in about, I'm not angling for Mark's cabinet position, by the way. This is my squishy liberal contribution here. I think also, aside from having that discussion about how we see work and jobs and occupation and inequality in the United States, just in terms of how humanely we treat immigrants. Trump was horrible, right? One of the consequences of the profoundly inhumane way that Trump wanted to treat immigrants meant that we lost our moral standing in the world. We couldn't stand up for anything. When you would have, it was like too easy for Putin to point at us and say, you can't attack what we're doing in Russia because look at what you're doing. And certainly a fair amount of that had to do with race, but some of it had to do with the way that we treat immigrants. And if we want to, now I'll stop being squishy. If we want to exercise power in a multilateral kind of way around the world, we need to have the sort of moral standing to engage in that kind of leadership. And if we improve the way in which we treat immigrants more humanely, that facilitates our ability to engage in that kind of diplomacy and foreign policy. And Mark will probably beat me up about this, so I'm gonna let him jump in.
No, I'm just listening. I am sort of interested in what everybody else thinks, because I've talked for a long time, and I think this is really the issue that we face in the future, I think, is how do we live with our diversity in a better way than we have in the past. I think there's been some improvements, but that's speaking from a fairly comfortable and privileged point of view. And so I don't,
I know that for me, right? So by living in South Florida, right? I live in Palm Beach County of South Florida, right? So we believe that Miami has done a really great job of encouraging multiculturalism, encouraging immigration, encouraging diversity, encouraging cultural inclusion, right? Because we have a little Havana and we have a little Haiti, and that's supposed to be the pocket that demonstrates the fact that our society is multicultural. But as somebody who just lives a little bit further north, and if anybody saw 60 Minutes and the story about the vaccinations first going in Palm Beach County to the town of Palm Beach, and none went out to the Glades, the predominantly immigrant community, servicing the farms that are taking over the Everglades and the sugar fields, and the challenge of issuing COVID vaccines there. This level of, we're a welcoming state, and South Florida is a welcoming community in one side of the perspective, but usually in name only. But in terms of the division of services to immigrant populations, we just don't have it figured out yet. And I think that's the biggest challenge that I see around the conversation we were having earlier about the distribution of services to immigrant communities, the ability to actually believe what people say about wanting to include immigrant communities in our way of life. What does that look like? And how do we not just talk the talk for a group of people in certain pockets and not everybody, right? It's a huge challenge. And I know that even here in South Florida, the conversation around immigration and who should come here and who should be turned away at the border is a very challenging conversation, even within the communities that were born of immigrants, right? It's a really challenging place to be. So I agree that the challenge is definitely there. The solutions are really hard to find. But I know that for me, just watching this sense of talk one way, treat people some way completely different, and they haven't really solved the problem of, and it's still happening today with the distribution of services that really should be global, right? There shouldn't be any, challenges there. So anyway, I digress, but it's definitely been as somebody watching and wanting to see pockets of true inclusion, right? You just feel like, oh, we've got so far to go.
We have a couple folks that want to chat off the record, off record. Are you good to stick around for a few more of those comments, Mark?
Sure.
Okay, great. I'll stop the recording.